The battlefield had gone silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after slaughter, the kind that presses against the ears like water, broken only by the distant crackle of dying fires and the whisper of ash falling like black snow. The ruins of Castile Nocturne spread across the hillside like the broken teeth of some ancient beast. Its towers collapsed into themselves, its walls split open to reveal chambers that had not seen moonlight in centuries. The ground was wet. Not with rain but with blood. So much blood that the earth could not drink it all, and it pooled in the cracks between stones, reflecting the swollen red moon that hung low and malevolent in the sky. Elias Thorne knelt in that blood, his hand pressed tight against his side where the armor had been torn away. His fingers were slick and warm, and he could feel his heartbeat pulsing against his palm with each throb of pain that radiated through his ribs. His sword lay 3 feet away, half buried in the corpse of something that had once been human. Or perhaps it had never been human at all. In this war it was becoming harder to tell. He tried to stand. His legs would not obey. The strength had bled out of him along with everything else, pooling beneath him in a spreading darkness that looked black in the moonlight. His breath came in short, sharp gasps that burned in his chest. Each one felt like it might be the last, and part of him, a tired, distant part that had seen too much and survived too long, thought that might not be such a terrible thing. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of ash and roses. Elias lifted his head, his vision swimming, and that was when he saw her. She descended from the broken tower like a falling star made flesh, like some terrible angel cast down from a heaven that had no more use for beauty that could kill. Her wings spread wide, vast membranes of shadow and crimson sinew stretched between bones that looked carved from obsidian. They caught the moonlight and shattered it into fragments of bloody illumination that danced across the ruins. Her hair was long and black as the space between stars, flowing behind her in impossible tendrils that moved against the wind rather than with it. Her armor was a work of art that had taken centuries to craft. Dark metal traced with silver in patterns that hurt to look at too long, gemstones the color of fresh blood set into plates that curved around a body that was both weapon and masterpiece. But it was her face that held him. Pale as carved marble, flawless as moonlight on still water, with eyes that burned like coals in a dying fire. Red eyes. Vampire eyes. Eyes that had watched empires rise and crumble, that had seen the birth and death of religions, that had witnessed humanity's capacity for both transcendent beauty and bottomless cruelty. Those eyes found him and the world seemed to stop. The vampire queen landed 20 feet away with a sound like a thunderclap muffled by earth. The ground beneath her feet cracked, spiderwebbing outward in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost like the mandala of some forgotten religion. She stood there for a moment, perfectly still, her wings folding behind her with a whisper of leather and bone. Then she moved. She was fast. Faster than thought, faster than fear. One moment she stood at a distance. The next she was there, kneeling before him, her hands reaching out and then stopping, hovering over his wound as if she were afraid to touch him. As if he were made of something more fragile than flesh. "You're hurt." Her voice was like nothing human, layered and resonant, as if multiple voices spoke in harmony from somewhere deep in her chest. There was something else in it too. Something that sounded almost like pain. Elias tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that brought the taste of copper to his mouth. Astute observation, he managed, his voice rough and weak. "The centuries have made you wise, Your Majesty." She did not smile. Her eyes moved over his wound with an intensity that was almost clinical, cataloging the damage with the expertise of someone who had both inflicted and suffered every possible injury a body could endure. Her hands trembled. It was such a small thing, such a human thing, that for a moment Elias forgot what she was. This should not have happened. The words came out quiet, but there was something terrible building behind them, something vast and old and full of rage that had nowhere to go. "You were not supposed to be here. You were supposed to stay with the rear guard. You were supposed to be safe." Safe. Elias repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. "There is no safe. Not in this war. Not in your war." Something flickered across her face, something that might have been guilt, might have been grief, might have been both tangled together so tightly that they had become the same thing. She shook her head and her hair moved like living smoke. "This is not my war. This war was forced upon me. Upon all of us. And yet you lead it." Elias felt his strength beginning to fade, felt the darkness at the edges of his vision starting to close in like a shroud. You raise the armies. You give the orders. You send men like me to die in ruins like this. To survive. The queen's voice cracked, and for just an instant, Elias heard something beneath the monster, something that remembered what it meant to be afraid. I give orders so that we might survive. All of us. Human and vampire alike. Noble. The word came out bitter. Tell that to the men who died tonight. Tell them how noble it was when the church's hunters tore through the western flank. Tell them how survival justified their. You were hurt because of me. The words cut through his anger like a blade through silk. Elias stopped, his breath catching in his throat for reasons that had nothing to do with the wound in his side. The queen had gone very still, her hands still hovering over him, her red eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as if she could see through flesh and bone to the truth beneath. What? You were hurt because of me. She said it again, slower this time, each word carrying the weight of something that might have been realization or might have been confession. The hunters broke through because I sent the Crimson Guard to the eastern approach. I thought the church would attack from the river. I was wrong. And you? Her eyes dropped to his wound and something in her expression crumbled. You threw yourself in front of Lady Vesper when the hunter came for her. I saw it. From the tower. I saw you take the blade meant for her throat. Elias blinked. His memory was fragmentary, broken into shards by pain and blood loss. He remembered the hunter, a man in white and silver, his blade burning with holy fire. He remembered Vesper, one of the queen's inner circle, her back turned as she fought 3 men at once. He remembered seeing the hunter's blade coming down, remembered his body moving before his mind could catch up, remembered the burning cold as blessed steel punched through his armor and into his flesh. She would have healed, he said, the words coming out hollow. Vampires heal. Humans don't. She would have died. The queen's voice had gone quiet again, but this time there was no rage beneath it. Only something that sounded like sorrow. Blessed steel through the heart. Even we cannot recover from that. You saved her life. You sacrificed yourself for one of my people. Your people are my people now. Elias felt the words leaving him, felt the truth of them settling in his chest beside the pain. I chose this. I chose your banner. Your cause. When my own kingdom cast me out, when the church branded me heretic for refusing to kill the vampire children in the village of Thornhaven, you offered me a place. You gave me purpose. If I die for that, then I die for something worth dying for. The queen stared at him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she reached up and removed one of her gauntlets. Her hand beneath was pale as porcelain, delicate and perfect, with long fingers tipped in nails like crimson glass. She reached out, hesitating for just a heartbeat, and then laid her palm flat against his wound. Elias gasped. Not from pain but from the sudden absence of it. Heat flooded through him, not the feverish heat of infection but something else entirely. Something that felt like sunlight captured and made gentle, like wine and honey in the first breath after drowning. Crimson light bloomed beneath her palm, spreading across his torn flesh like liquid fire. He felt his skin knitting together, felt the severed muscle reweaving itself, felt bones that had been cracked straightening and fusing whole. The magic sang. It moved through him in waves, each one carrying memories that were not his own. He saw centuries flash past, cities built and burned, kingdoms rising from mud and returning to it, faces he did not know speaking languages that had died before his grandfather's grandfather was born. And through it all, like a thread of crimson running through darkness, he saw her. The queen. Alone. Always alone even when surrounded by thousands. Watching humanity grow and change and destroy itself in endless cycles. Watching her own kind dwindle and hide and forget what they had been. Watching the world become something she no longer recognized. Then the magic faded, and the memories went with it, leaving only the ghost of their passage like the aftertaste of wine. Elias looked down at his side. The wound was gone. Not healed, gone as if it had never existed. Even the blood had evaporated, leaving only the torn fabric of his shirt to prove that he had ever been injured at all. He looked up at the queen. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling beneath her armor, her eyes dimmed as if the light behind them had been partially extinguished. Healing magic. She had used her own life force to knit his flesh. For vampires of her age and power, such magic was taxing. dangerous even. And she had done it without hesitation. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. She met his gaze, and for the first time since he had known her, since he had knelt before her throne and sworn his oath to her cause, he saw something in her eyes that looked almost like vulnerability. Because you were hurt because of me, she said, and her voice was raw and soft and utterly certain. Because I sent you to this place. Because I made the choice that put you in harm's way. Because you sacrificed yourself to protect one of mine, and she paused, and something in her expression shifted, hardened, crystallized into something that looked like iron forged in blood. I won't allow that again. You can't promise that. Elias found his strength returning, felt his legs steadying beneath him. He pushed himself to his feet, and she rose with him, her wings spreading slightly as if to steady him should he fall. This is war. People get hurt. People die. You can't protect everyone. No, the queen's eyes blazed back to full brightness, crimson fire burning in the darkness. But I can protect you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was ready to name. Around them, the ruins of Castile Nocturne stood silent and broken, bearing witness to something that might have been a vow or might have been a promise or might have been the first thread of something that would either save them both or destroy everything they had fought to build. Elias opened his mouth to respond, to protest, to argue that he was just one soldier among thousands, that his life was no more valuable than any other, that she could not afford to make such promises in a war that had already consumed so much. But before he could speak, before he could give voice to any of those objections, a sound cut through the night. A horn, deep and resonant and full of warning. They both turned toward the eastern wall. Beyond it, in the valley below, lights were beginning to appear. Torches. Hundreds of them. Thousands. The church's reinforcements had arrived sooner than expected, and they had brought an army that outnumbered the queen's forces 3-1. The queen's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to commanding, from the woman who had knelt to heal a dying soldier to the general who had held the darkness at bay for 3 centuries. Her wings spread to their full span, a cape of shadow and blood that blotted out the moon. Her hand moved to the sword at her hip, a blade forged before Christianity had reached these lands, before Rome had fallen, before the pyramids had risen from Egyptian sand. Can you fight? She did not look at him as she asked, her eyes fixed on the approaching army, calculating angles and strategies and acceptable losses with the cold efficiency of someone who had fought more battles than most kingdoms had waged in their entire histories. Elias checked his body. The wound was gone, and with it the weakness. He felt strong. Stronger than he had in weeks, as if her magic had not merely healed him but revitalized him, poured some essential vitality back into flesh that had been running on will and desperation for too long. He retrieved his sword, testing its weight, and found his grip steady. I can fight. Good. The queen's voice had taken on that layered quality again, the sound that made it clear she was speaking not just to him but to something larger, to her army, to her people, to the night itself. Then stay close to me. What I said before? She paused, and for just an instant she glanced back at him, and there was something in her eyes that made his breath catch. I meant it. You don't leave my sight. Not tonight. Not ever again. Before he could respond, she launched herself into the air, her wings catching the wind and propelling her upward with a force that created a shockwave in the dust below. Elias felt himself lifted, caught in some invisible current of her magic, and then he was rising too, drawn up into the sky behind her like flotsam in the wake of some vast ship. They soared over the ruins, over the broken walls and shattered towers, and Elias had a moment to see the full scope of what remained of the queen's forces. They were so few. Barely 300 fighters, a mix of vampires, humans who had defected from their own kingdoms, and stranger things, creatures from the deep forests and high mountains who remembered when the world had been wild and who had no love for the church that had hunted them to the brink of extinction. They stood among the ruins, weapons drawn, facing an army that stretched from horizon to horizon like a sea of torchlight and steel. It should have been despair. It should have been the moment when even the bravest hearts broke and ran. But as the queen descended into the center of her forces, as her wings spread and her voice rang out across the broken stones, something else happened instead. Children of the night. Her words were thunder and music, were a war cry and a hymn all at once. Children of the old world and the new. They come for us with fire and faith, with steel blessed and prayers spoken, with the certainty of those who believe themselves righteous. She turned, her cape swirling around her, her sword raised high so that it caught the moonlight and threw it back in crimson fragments. But we know the truth. We know that righteousness without mercy is just cruelty wearing a halo. We know that faith without compassion is just fear dressed in ceremony. And we know that we are not the monsters they claim we are. A roar went up from her forces, human throats and inhuman both, a sound of defiance that echoed across the valley and made the approaching army falter in their advance. Tonight, they will try to break us. The queen continued, her voice rising higher, carrying further, infused with magic that made every word resonate in the chest like a second heartbeat. They will try to drive us from these ruins, to scatter us into the darkness, to erase us from history as they have erased so much else. But I make you this promise. She paused, and her eyes found Elias standing among the crowd, and something passed between them that no one else could see, a shared understanding of what promises meant, what they cost, what they required. I will not allow it. Not one more. Not tonight. Not while I still draw breath and have strength to stand. You are mine to protect, and I swear on blood and bone and the name I bore before I was made what I am, I will see every one of you live to see the dawn. The roar that followed was deafening. Elias found himself shouting with them, his sword raised, his voice joining the chorus of the damned and the defiant. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of a castle that had stood for 1,000 years, surrounded by those that the world had cast out and condemned, he felt something he had not felt since the church had burned his home and murdered his family for the crime of sheltering a vampire child from the sun. He felt like he belonged. The battle began with arrows. They came from the approaching army in waves, thousands of shafts arcing through the night sky like steel rain. The queen's magic flared, and a barrier of crimson light bloomed above them, a dome of translucent energy that caught the arrows and burned them to ash before they could fall. But the effort cost her. Elias could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, in the faint tremor that ran through her wings. Shields up. Someone shouted, Vesper, the vampire noblewoman Elias had saved, her voice clear and commanding as she raised her own weapon. Mages to the front. Counter their priests. The battle formation shifted. Those with magic moved forward, hands already weaving patterns in the air that pulled at the fabric of reality itself. Elias found himself pushed toward the center, toward where the queen stood directing her forces with gestures and short, sharp commands. He tried to move to the flank to take his place with the other human soldiers, but each time he moved away, he felt a subtle pull, a gentle but insistent force that guided him back toward her. She had meant what she said. She was not going to let him out of her sight. The church's army reached the base of the hill and began their ascent. They moved in tight formations, shields locked, their armor gleaming with holy wards that made the vampires hiss and recoil even from a distance. At their front walked the paladins, warriors who had undergone the church's most sacred rites, whose bodies had been infused with divine magic that made them nearly invincible, nearly incorruptible, nearly unstoppable. Nearly. The first line of paladins hit the queen's outer defenses like a wave hitting a cliff. The sound was tremendous, steel on steel, flesh on stone, magic on faith. Spells erupted in cascades of color, blood sprayed in arterial arcs, men and women and creatures beyond naming fell screaming or silent or simply ceased to be, unmade by forces they barely understood. The night air filled with smoke and the stench of burning flesh and the terrible music of war. Elias fought. He moved through the chaos with the sword that the queen had given him months ago, a blade forged by vampire smiths from steel that had drunk the blood of stars. It cut through blessed armor like parchment, turned aside holy magic like water, and sang in his hands with a voice that was almost alive. He fought beside creatures he had been taught since childhood to fear and hate. Vampires with eyes like rubies and fangs like daggers, werewolves who wore human skin until the moment they didn't, fey warriors who moved like wind and struck like lightning. And through it all, he felt her presence. The queen never left his side. Even when she soared above the battle, raining death upon the church's forces with magic that turned men to ash or stone or memories that faded before they hit the ground, even then he felt her attention on him, a weight like sunlight or a hand on his shoulder. Twice a paladin broke through the line and came for him, and twice the queen was there, descending like divine wrath itself, her sword opening throats and splitting armor and sending holy warriors to meet the god they claimed to serve. I told you to stay close, she said after the second time, not even breathing hard despite the carnage she had just inflicted. Her armor was splashed with blood, some of it likely her own, and her eyes burned with battle fury. But when she looked at him, when she checked him for injuries with that same hovering gesture she had used before, the fury dimmed into something else. Something almost tender. "I was close," Elias argued, parrying a blow from a church soldier and running him through in one fluid motion. "I was right here. Not close enough." She caught his wrist, and suddenly they were moving, her wings carrying them both up and away from the main battle, landing on a section of broken wall that gave them a vantage point over the entire field. "Look." He looked. The battle was not going well. For every church soldier they felled, 2 more took his place. The Queen's forces were skilled and desperate and fighting for their very survival, but they were being pushed back, step by bloody step, toward the center of the ruins where there would be nowhere left to retreat. "We can't hold," Elias said, the words bitter as ash in his mouth. "Not against these numbers." "No," the Queen's voice was quiet. "We cannot hold. But we do not need to hold. We need to survive until the signal." "What signal?" She smiled. It was a terrible smile, full of secrets and strategies and plans laid months in advance. "You are not the only one who knows how to sacrifice for the greater good, Elias Thorne." Before he could ask what she meant, the eastern sky lit up. Not with dawn, it was still hours until dawn, but with fire. Enormous pillars of flame erupted from the church's rear positions, and even from this distance, Elias could hear the screams. The army began to turn, confusion rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. Their supply lines were burning. Their siege engines were exploding. Their reinforcements were under attack. The Black Hawks, Elias breathed recognition dawning. The Queen's elite strike force, 200 of her deadliest warriors, who had been conspicuously absent from tonight's defense. "You sent them around?" "3 days ago." The Queen's smile widened. While the church was mustering their forces, bragging about how they would finally destroy the vampire queen and her monstrous army, my hawks were moving through the underground rivers that run beneath this valley. While their priests were blessing their weapons and their paladins were making their oaths, my people were positioning themselves behind enemy lines. And now, the church's army broke. Not all at once, but in sections as units turned to face the new threat and found themselves caught between 2 forces. Confusion became panic, panic became rout, and within minutes the organized assault had dissolved into chaos. "Now we finish it." The Queen's wings spread and she rose into the air, her voice booming across the battlefield with supernatural volume. "Forward. Drive them back. Show them that we do not die quietly. Show them that we remember every village they burned, every child they murdered, every innocent life they took in the name of their righteous crusade. Tonight we show them what it means to make monsters out of those who only wanted to live." The tide turned. The Queen's forces, bolstered by hope and fury, surged forward. Elias found himself swept up in the charge, his sword wet with blood that was not his own, his voice joining the war cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. They drove the church's army down the hill, past the ruins into the valley where the Black Hawks were waiting. It became a slaughter. Not one that Elias took pleasure in, he had seen too much death to take pleasure in any of it, but one that was necessary. The church had come to commit genocide. They had brought an army large enough to wipe out every vampire, every human sympathizer, every creature that had sought shelter under the Queen's banner. If they had won tonight, if they had broken through the defenses and overwhelmed the ruins, there would have been no mercy. No prisoners. No survivors. So there was no mercy now. The battle raged until the moon began to set, until the sky in the east started to lighten from black to gray. The church's forces, what remained of them, broke entirely and fled into the forest, abandoning their weapons and their wounded in their desperation to escape. The Queen let them go. Not out of mercy. Elias had learned that the Queen was capable of mercy, but also that she understood when mercy was a luxury one could not afford, but out of practicality. Every soldier who ran was a soldier who would return to the church with stories of what had happened here, stories of the vampire queen's power and the futility of attacking her directly. Sometimes the Queen had once told him the most effective weapon is fear. As the last of the church's army disappeared into the trees, as the Queen's forces began to regroup and tend to their wounded and mourn their dead, Elias found himself standing in the valley, surrounded by corpses and blood-soaked earth, feeling the exhaustion of the night settling into his bones like lead. His sword slipped from his fingers, too heavy to hold any longer. His legs trembled, threatening to give way. Then she was there. The queen landing beside him with barely a sound, her wings folding back as she reached out to steady him. Her hands gripped his shoulders, and he felt that same warmth from before, that gentle infusion of strength that kept him on his feet. "Enough," she said, her voice soft again, the battle fury gone from it. "You've done enough." "Did we win?" The words came out slurred, exhaustion making it hard to think. "We survived." She looked around at the battlefield, at the dead and dying, at the ruins of Castile Nocturne still standing on the hill behind them. In this war, survival is victory. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to point out that survival was not victory, that they had merely postponed their destruction, that the church would come again with more soldiers and more paladins and more holy fire. But he was too tired. Too tired to argue, too tired to think, too tired to do anything but stand there and let the queen hold him up. "Come," she said, and her wings wrapped around them both, a shelter from the coming dawn. "Let me take you somewhere safe." She lifted him into her arms, and he should have felt embarrassed, should have protested that he was a soldier and could walk on his own, but he couldn't find the energy. She carried him up the hill, back through the ruins into the depths of the castle where the sun could not reach. The throne room was mostly intact, its vaulted ceiling still standing despite the battle that had raged outside. She set him down on the steps leading up to her throne, then sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, he could hear the sounds of her people beginning the grim work of cleaning up after battle. The wounded being carried to safety, the dead being gathered for burial or burning, depending on what they had been in life. Weapons were collected, armor repaired, defenses rebuilt. The war continued as it always continued in the space between battles. "You were right," the queen said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, thoughtful, almost human. "About not being able to protect everyone. I cannot. I have tried for 300 years and I have failed more times than I can count. I have watched so many die. So many who trusted me, who believed in me, who thought that following me would lead them to safety." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were no longer burning with power or fury or any of the things that made her seem like something beyond mortal ken. They were just eyes. Tired eyes. Sad eyes. "But I can protect you. I will protect you. Because you are different." "Different how?" Elias asked, though part of him already knew the answer, had known it since she knelt beside him in the blood and ash and healed his wound with her own life force. "You are the first person in 200 years to sacrifice yourself for one of my people without hesitation," she said. "Not out of obligation or fear or even loyalty, but simply because it was the right thing to do. You saw Vesper about to die, and you did not see a vampire or a monster or something to be feared. You saw a person. And you chose to save her, even though it meant your own death." She reached out and took his hand, her pale fingers wrapping around his blood-stained ones. "I have spent centuries trying to convince the world that we are not monsters, that we can coexist, that we deserve to live. And in one moment, you proved what I have been trying to prove for longer than your civilization has existed." Elias looked down at their joined hands. Her skin was cool against his, but not cold. Not dead. Just different. "I don't understand." "I know." She smiled, and it was a sad smile, a smile that carried the weight of centuries. "But you will. In time you will understand what you represent. Hope. Change. The possibility that this war does not have to end in genocide. The possibility that humans and vampires can be more than enemies. The possibility that I have not been fighting for nothing all these years. That's a lot of weight to put on one soldier," Elias said, trying to inject some levity into his voice and failing. "Yes." She squeezed his hand. "Which is why I will protect you. Not just because of what you represent, but because—" She hesitated, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked uncertain. "Vulnerable. Because when I saw you dying in the courtyard, when I saw the blood and knew that you had been hurt because of my decisions, something inside me broke. Something I thought had died centuries ago. And I realized that I cannot lose you. I will not lose you. Not to the church, not to this war, not to anything. I swear it." Elias felt something shift in his chest. It was not love. Not yet, not quite. It was too new, too raw, too complicated by the circumstances of war and the difference in what they were. But it was the seed of something that might become love, given time and nurturing and the slim chance that they might both survive long enough to see it grow. Then I swear the same, he said, the words coming out before he could think them through. I will not let you face this war alone. I will fight beside you, protect your people, stand with you against whatever comes. And when you fall, she opened her mouth to protest, but he continued, his voice firm. Because we both know that even you can fall, even you can be overwhelmed. When that happens, I will catch you. I will pull you back from the darkness. I will remind you why we're fighting. That is my oath to you. The queen stared at him, her red eyes wide, something that might have been tears gathering at their corners, though he knew vampires could not cry. Not really. Not the way humans did. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, her cool skin against his warm, her breath mingling with his in the space between them. Then we are bound, she whispered. By blood and oath and battle. We are bound. We are bound, Elias echoed and felt the truth of it settle into his bones like fate. They sat that way for a long time, two figures in the darkness of a ruined throne room, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the promise of more to come. Outside, the sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that neither of them could see from the depths of the castle. But they could feel it, the warmth of a new day beginning, the promise that they had survived one more night, that they had earned one more chance to fight for the world they believed could exist. Eventually they would have to rise. Eventually they would have to face the reality of what tonight had cost, of how many had died, of how much harder the church would strike next time. Eventually, they would have to plan and strategize and make the hard choices that came with leadership in a war that had no good options. But for now, in this moment, they simply sat together. Two souls bound by oath and circumstance, by shared trauma and fragile hope, by the unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next together. And in the darkness of Castile Nocturne, as the world outside turned toward morning, that was enough. The war had changed. Not ended. Wars like this one, wars built on centuries of hatred and fear and religious fervor, did not end easily or quickly. But it had changed in ways both subtle and profound, in ways that rippled out from that night in the ruins like stones dropped in still water. The church still came with their armies and their paladins and their holy fire. But they came less often and with less certainty. The story of what had happened at Castile Nocturne had spread, growing in the telling until it had taken on the quality of legend. They spoke of the vampire queen who had healed a dying human with her own life force, who had sworn to protect him at any cost. They spoke of the human soldier who had sacrificed himself to save a vampire, who had proven that the queen's people were worth dying for. Some of the stories were exaggerated. Some were outright fabrications. But the core truth remained, and that truth was more dangerous to the church's crusade than any army. The monsters were not monstrous. They were people. Different, perhaps. Frightening, certainly. But capable of the same loyalty, the same sacrifice, the same capacity for both good and evil as any human. And if they were people, then maybe they did not deserve to be exterminated. It started small. A village on the western border that refused to provide soldiers for the church's next campaign. A lord who publicly questioned whether the crusade was truly righteous. A priest who stood before his congregation and asked if perhaps God's mercy extended even to those who walked in darkness. Each act of defiance was punished, but each punishment created more questions, more doubts, more cracks in the facade of certainty that the church had built over centuries. The queen's forces grew. Not dramatically, the decades of propaganda and persecution could not be undone in months, but steadily. Humans who had lost faith in the church's methods found their way to her banner. Vampires who had been hiding in the shadows, trying to survive alone, came out of their sanctuaries and joined her army. Other creatures, sensing a shift in the balance of power, made their allegiances known. And at the center of it all stood two figures who had become symbols of what the future might hold: the vampire queen and her mortal champion. They fought side by side in every battle, she with her ancient power and terrible grace, he with his blessed blade and unwavering loyalty. She kept her promise. He never left her sight, never faced danger alone, never went into battle without her presence either beside him or above him or somewhere nearby. And he kept his. When the weight of centuries threatened to crush her, when the deaths of her people cut too deep, when she stood on the edge of despair and wondered if any of this was worth it, he was there to pull her back, to remind her of why they fought, to show her that hope was not just a memory of something she had lost long ago. They never spoke of what existed between them. It was too complicated, too fragile, too dangerous to name. The war left little room for anything as human as romance, as gentle as love. But it was there nonetheless, growing in the spaces between battles, in the quiet moments when she would check his wounds with that same hovering gesture and he would catch her hand and hold it until she smiled. It was there in the way she positioned herself in every fight to keep him in her line of sight, in the way he learned to sense when she needed blood and would offer his wrist without being asked. It was there in the darkness of the throne room, in the conversations that stretched into dawn, in the shared understanding that they had become something to each other that neither of them had words for. On the 6-month anniversary of the battle at Castile Nocturne, they stood together on the highest tower of the rebuilt fortress and looked out over the land they had fought so hard to defend. The ruins had been transformed, not restored to what they had been but built into something new, something that blended the old vampire architecture with human sensibilities, that made room for both those who walked in sunlight and those who dwelt in darkness. "Do you think we can win?" Elias asked, the question that neither of them had dared voice before. The queen was quiet for a long moment, her red eyes scanning the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of crimson and gold. Finally she spoke. "I do not know. The church is vast and old and certain of their righteousness. They will not surrender easily. And even if we defeat them, even if we force them to the negotiating table, there will be others who rise up to take their place. Hatred is easier than understanding. Fear is simpler than acceptance. We may fight this war for the rest of your lifetime and beyond." "That's not an answer." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. The idea that hope might be possible. "No," she agreed. "But it is the truth. And the truth is that I do not know if we can win this war. But I know that we can survive it. That we can build something worth surviving for. That we can prove, day by day and battle by battle, that the world does not have to be divided into monsters and men. That there is another way." She reached out and took his hand, her cool fingers intertwining with his warm ones. "You asked me once why you were different. This is why. Because you make me believe that this future is possible. That I am not fighting alone. That when I fall, someone will catch me." Elias squeezed her hand. "Always." "Always," she repeated, and for the first time in 300 years, the vampire queen allowed herself to believe it. Behind them, the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge from the velvet darkness of the sky. The war continued. It would continue for years, perhaps decades, perhaps longer. But in that moment, standing together on the tower of Castile Nocturne with their hands joined and their oaths binding them to each other and to the cause they both believed in, they were not afraid. They had survived. They had each other. And sometimes, in a world torn apart by hatred and fear, that was enough to change everything. The crimson oath had been spoken, and it would not be broken.